Creepypasta time. I was my mother's muse, but it nearly killed me. Years ago, when I was born, I was the most beautiful baby. I lived in a small, strange town, and the local paper even ran an article after my birth. Its author praised me for my angelic appearance, for my gentle temperament. Mother nearly bought the corner store out of their entire supply that week, her long, manicured nails hungrily tearing through the pages until she located my story. The piece ran on page 8, only a couple paragraphs, but still, that was more than enough for her to latch onto, to sink her claws into. As soon as I was old enough to understand, she regaled me with tales of my birth, told me how from the moment I was born, everyone loved me. The whole town loved me enough to celebrate my entrance into the world. See? Right here. Acrylic nails pointing, French tips feverishly tapping the page. You were the most beautiful baby this town, this world, has ever seen. The first story she ever read me was the story of my birth, a compelling tale of how an entire town put aside their differences, how they gathered together to laud the arrival of the most beautiful baby. Mother read me the story nearly every evening before bed, read it until the paper was worn thin and the oil from her fingertips had smudged the ink, individual letters and whole words blurring into an indistinguishable mess. No matter, she'd say, pulling another copy from her stockpile, and the cycle would repeat once more. Eventually, she just recited the words by heart. This child will live a life of excellence, she'd gush, because of the beautiful features God Himself has graced her with. This line would come to haunt me, would insert itself into my thoughts in the worst moments of my life, would lie in wait in the deepest recesses of my mind. It would become the bane of my entire existence, as I would come to understand just how wrong the reporter got it. My appearance was not a blessing from a compassionate, caring God, it could only be understood as a curse laid upon me by some conniving witch, some haggard goblin. Perhaps even the devil himself. I'll admit that. At first, it felt good to be loved, not just by my mother, but by the entire town, especially since my father didn't stick around to meet me at my most momentous birth. Strangers would stop to pay me a compliment, sometimes even giving me a sucker or a gumball, nearly every time we left the house to run errands. Despite the constant attention, I was a shy kid, never really knew how to respond. But my mother was quick to step in. Isn't she just precious, though? You know, she was the most beautiful baby. My mother thought so highly of me, revered me so deeply, that she was even inspired to return to an old hobby of hers, painting. She pulled all of her abandoned materials from the garage, long packed away in musty boxes, entirely forgotten until a spark of inspiration struck her, reinvigorated her passion. My little muse, she'd coo, as she dressed me in stiff and itchy dresses, as she sat me down on a miniature stool, as she tut-tutted at me to stay still while she worked. Each day, I sat still as a picture. Each day, I stole glances out the window at the other children playing, free of a single worry, a single responsibility, a single burden. Each day, a portrait was produced. Mother would clap her hands together gleefully, her apron speckled with brights and pastels, and call me to her side. And each day, she'd glimmer with pride, with devotion, as she revealed her latest masterpiece. She'd draw me in for a hug, tucking my platinum hair behind my ear to whisper, "My perfect little muse, you've done it again. You brilliant little girl, you." My greatest error was mistaking her pride for love. Mother made a small fortune selling my portraits, leading to more and more sessions, more and more hours spent frozen in time until I struggled just to identify myself as a living, breathing being. I sat on that stool for so long, shoulders down, chin up, straight back, Missy. Dash that I felt more like a picture than a little girl, more like a series of fractured moments, of captured images perfect in isolation, yet failing to add up to a real person when viewed all together. I lost myself while she gained world renown for her art, riches beyond her wildest belief, her perfect subject always at arm's reach. Much to Mother's dismay, I grew up, outgrew the collection of starchy, pleated dresses, outgrew the little stool, outgrew the blind subservience she'd come to expect from me. At 13, I got my first pimple. No matter, she clucked, and overlooked the blemish in her finished portrait. I broke out in a full face of acne the next day. At 14, the beginnings of breasts strained against the bleached fabric of my childhood dress. No matter, she sighed, and painted a perfectly flat, prepubescent chest in its place. At school the following morning, I bled for the first time, the stain blossoming right through my skirt. No matter how I aged, no matter how I developed, Mother's portraits continued to reflect a past version of myself, a version of myself that I never knew. Eventually, I stopped sitting for her. I kicked over jugs of paint, put my fist through blank canvases. "Darling, please come sit for Mommy. Be a good girl, now, sweetie. Mommy just needs you for a few hours, is all. Don't you leave Mommy out in the cold, dearie. Mommy has an installation due for a new gallery opening next week, you know Mommy can't do this without you, without her splendid, flawless muse." The constant manipulation and guilting worked until it didn't. I left home as young as I possibly could, but found myself wildly unprepared and ill-equipped to enter a world that felt so foreign, so alien to me. Everything was in constant motion. All of its moving parts blurred together to give me double vision, making me dizzy, lightheaded. I found work in modeling, believing my appearance to be the only value I had to offer. I celebrated initial success in the industry, made my way up the ladder from catalog spreads to high fashion shoots and runway couture. It was in hair and makeup for one of these shows when I noticed the first sign of deterioration. I leaned forward into the mirror, so close that the tip of my nose grazed the cool surface, to examine the crow's feet that had sprouted along the corners of my eyes. I tried frantically to rub the lines away, pinched them between panicked fingers to pluck them right off my face, but there was no denying it. I was aging, but I was only 20, and I adhered to a strict beauty regimen. I swallowed my apprehensions to walk the show, but skipped champagne and after-parties in favor of heading straight home. I turned on every light in the bathroom, even dragged in a few lamps from around the house, and stood before the mirror, picking apart my appearance. Throughout the night, even only over those few hours, lines, age spots, wrinkles cropped up across my face. The undersides of my eyes darkened, began to swell with puffy bags. Terrified, I cancelled all my appointments, locked myself away in my apartment. My condition only worsened over the following week. Wrinkles in my face deepened, my eyes grew dull. The skin on my neck and upper arms started to sag and droop, the skin fragile to the touch. Gray hairs grew in at an alarming rate until they overtook the bright blonde hair that should have been there. It only took 2 weeks for me to age into a weary elderly woman. My joints ached and groaned with every movement, my vision rapidly decayed. I hunched forward at the shoulders, couldn't straighten my back even if I subjected myself to the pain of trying. I felt feeble, exhausted, drained. Old. I was only 20 years old, but I looked nearly 90. That's when Mother called. In my fear and confusion, I found myself thankful for familiar contact. Any warmth I momentarily held within me evaporated as soon as she spoke, immediately replaced by a stone, by ice. "Mommy's finally back on her feet. Took her a long time to get over losing you." "It certainly did, but she's got an installation coming up. Wouldn't you come sit for Mommy one last time?" I let myself into the old house the next morning, calling out for Mother but received no response. I walked through the entryway, down the long hallway toward her bedroom. The walls were covered with pictures. Portraits of me, the me I never knew, a life I never lived. But these were new, painted from memory, undeniably beautiful yet imperfect without her muse to replicate on stretches of canvas. I gently nudged her bedroom door open, then nearly toppled backwards at the side of the room. All 4 walls were lined top to bottom with clippings from catalogs, from fashion magazines. All of her makeshift wallpaper featured me, printed photos from my career, from the very first shoot to the very last. My stomach turned as I craned my weak neck up to the ceiling where she'd pasted overlapping newspaper pages, each one the same. Page 8, dated 20 years back. The words glared down at me in a menacing repetition. "Town's most beautiful baby born today, town's most beautiful baby born today, town's most beautiful baby born today, town's most dash." And then, total darkness. I woke up to the most horrifying scene I could possibly imagine, my worst nightmare, the one I'd lived through time and time again. Back once more. Only this time, I was shackled at the wrists and ankles. I felt as if I'd been simultaneously catapulted both forward and backward through time, seated on that too small stool in a frail old body. Captured in 3 separate moments, the past, the future, and the dreadful present. Mother perched across from me, from behind her canvas. She twirled her brush in a pastel pink to match the dress she'd crammed me in while I was out, dreaming of anywhere but here. She abandoned the brush for another, dipped it tenderly in a glass of water, carefully applied the paint to its tip. "Now sit still for me, sweetheart, we don't want any frivolous movements to muss up your hair." Fragile gray strands fell from my scalp, littering the floor, as she made quick flicks with her thin brush. "My darling, how dreary you look." "No matter," she breathed, clicking her tongue. My skin grew paper thin, the bones of my hand clearly visible beneath the fragile pallor. With each dramatic brushstroke, my breaths grew shallow, labored, my pulse weaker, slower. Mother brought the tip of her brush to the corner of her lips, deep in thought. "Now, what to do about these shackles? If you'd have just come back to mommy on your own, my little muse, we wouldn't have to worry about them at all." A deep sigh. "No matter." She went back to work to painting me as I was not, painting me as a willing participant in her sick charade, free of the shackles that confined me. The metal binding seized tighter around my wrists, my ankles, restricting my blood flow until I could barely feel them. Mother finished up with a gleeful clasp of her hands, then patted across the room to free me. Strenuously, I eased myself up from the stool to trudge across the room. "Silly girl, why are you such a slowpoke all of a sudden?" "No matter, come look at mommy's painting, her greatest creation yet." I wept at the sight of it, a rendition of a sweet, angelic, beautiful baby with a patch of bright blonde hair, captured in a moment of true perfection. The only version of myself that mother had ever wanted, had ever loved, the town's most beautiful baby, born today. Mother looked to me for praise, for approval, yet I just couldn't stand her eyes on me for a second longer. I couldn't stand to be observed by her, to be interpreted by her, to be perverted by her gaze anymore. With the last of my remaining energy, I tore the paintbrush from her clutches and thrust it straight through her eye socket, puncturing the organ at its center. Mother wailed as I urged it deeper, twisted it, pulled it back out. She fell to the floor, screeching in agony, and I came down with her. A renewed energy flowed through me as I rammed the wooden handle into her other eye, harder this time, until it popped and oozed, blood spattering across the pleats of my ill-fitted dress. Mother gurgled and moaned helplessly as I leapt to my feet, shocked by the sudden ease. The wrinkles and lines and spots melted from my face, the skin on my arms tightened, regained its youthful glow. I straightened my back, standing tall over Mother, gazing down at her body, at her brutalized, useless eyes. I was my mother's muse, but I will never have to sit for her again.